In the 18th century, more than any other, though, Europeans were inclined to feel that the best way of explaining anything was to arrange relevant data into some meaningful order. The simplest method was to fasten upon one characteristic in which men differed and to group them accordingly.
The one characteristic that the Europeans would latch onto would be the various skin complexions of the human family. And so we're reading from the book White Over Black by Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan. And so throughout the development of some European cultures, they had become increasingly obsessed with physical differences of people, and they would eventually go on to exploit those differences for their own profits and their own gains. And so this had its beginning, just like a lot of the Western world that we're familiar with, during the colonial period where the European colonizers went about conquering and controlling the world. And so during this process, they would eventually condition a large portion of the world to willingly accept many of these categorizations that they came up with, even if they were against those people's own best interests. And so now let's go ahead and look into how these European rankings of humans developed over time.
The first European to take this approach with all mankind, Francois Bernier, in 1684, ran smack into the obvious difficulty of choosing a characteristic. Although he discussed a variety of features such as hair, stature, and shape of nose and lips, when he came down to making his Nouvelle Division de la Terre, he relied more upon color than anything else in chopping mankind into 4, or possibly, Bernier thought, 5 or 6 categories: the Europeans, Africans, Orientals, Lapps, wretched animals, and perhaps American Indians and Hottentots. Bernier's classification was prophetic not only in its stress on color, but in its basic aim of dividing all mankind into discrete groups on the basis of physical attributes.
Francois Bernier was the first European on record to start placing humans in categories based on physical features. And so he categorized people based on what he believed to work best according to his understanding of the world. And so skin color played the biggest role in the categories that he created. Understand?
It was Linnaeus who first fully transformed the game into a science.
Carl Linnaeus was responsible for creating the scientific classifications that are widely used in the biological sciences. And so when you see things like Homo erectus or Homo sapiens, that style of classification, it came from Carl Linnaeus.
In the 1730s, he took the fateful step of classifying mankind as an integral part of the animal creation, thereby dramatically underlining the fact that man was, after all, a physical being.
Linnaeus lumped humans and animals into the same category, and when he did this, a lot of people, they didn't like this at that time, and that's because they were under the assumption that man was created to rule over all the animals and to rule over nature, and it was not to be equal with it.
Here was a new tool with which order could be hammered into the natural world, and it was as eagerly grasped in America as anywhere. Linnaean classification was not, however, the only attractive method of making nature dance to the natural philosopher's tune. An ancient concept with roots deep in classical Greece was reaching full flower in the 17th and 18th centuries, a concept which had the merit of systematizing all creation and even the Creator himself. The idea of the great chain of being possessed all the power and all the weaknesses of any gigantic synthesis.
The great chain of being is an idea developed by Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and so it reached its full maturity during the colonial period in the 16 and 1700s. And so what was the idea of the great chain of being about?
The chain of being, as usually conceived, commenced with inanimate things and ranged upwards through the lowliest forms of life, for it continued upward through the myriad ranks of heavenly creatures until it reached its pinnacle in God.
It's a ranking system of all things known to humans, right? Starting with inanimate objects, or what is considered to be non-living things, being at the bottom, and then working its way up to more intelligent forms of life, right? With the human being in the middle, and then progressing further into imagined beings like angels and other heavenly beings until you get to the very top, which is where you have the idea of God.
As a means of conceptualizing the differences among the creatures of the natural world, the great chain of being differed appreciably from the method forged by Linnaeus. It was one thing to classify all living creation and altogether another to arrange it in a single great hierarchy, and when Linnaeus undertook the first of these tasks, he was not thereby forced to attempt the latter. In the many editions of the Systema Naturae, he duly catalogued the various kinds of men, yet never in a hierarchic manner.
Now he's saying that Linnaeus did not have in mind a hierarchy system when he created his classification. But the truth is that his hierarchy was more of a subtle thing, right? And it was not as obvious in the way that he described the different types of humans. And so, for example, he described the Europeus as cheerful, muscular, light, wise, inventor, protected by clothing, and governed by a religion, right? All these were apparently positive things at that particular time, right? And these were descriptions of the European. But when we get to Americanus, or the Native American, he has them as being bad-tempered, right? And he has the Asiaticus, or the Asian, as being sad and greedy, right? He didn't see the European as being greedy by stealing the land and stealing the resources and wanting to control everyone on the earth, but somehow he managed to see the Asian as being a greedy person, right? And so it's amazing what people can do with the power of interpretation, right? But look at this here. The Africanus, or the person that is named a black person, he has them slammed with all types of negative traits, right? Black being one of them, right? Because that's not the color of the African skin, right? That's a derogatory term in the English westernized type of thinking. And so they tagged him with that label from the get-go, right? But they also have other things on here like being unemotional and lazy, right? He describes them as being sly, sluggish, and neglectful, right? And so notice that he gave the European all positive traits, and then he gave the African all negative traits, right? And then he gave the other two some positive and then some negative traits, right? And so this is how there is still some subtle ranking in his classification.
Thus, while there were hints of ranking in the Linnaean approach, the concept of hierarchy was never really developed.
Which is what we just went over.
The Linnaean approach passed on into modern anthropology by way of Johann Blmenbach, the great physiologist and comparative anatomist who is often called the founder of anthropology.
Johann Blmenbach. This is another person that you must be familiar with in order to understand how this current system of racial classification developed.
Although a great admirer of Linnaeus, Blmenbach rightly saw Linnaeus's categories to be crude and inadequate, while politely palliating these defects by pointing to the lack of information available to Linnaeus. Blmenbach deliberately undertook a major revision of the categories of men.
Now, how did Blmenbach divide the human family in his revision? He divided them into Oriental, American Indian, Caucasian, Malay, and Ethiopian. That was his revision.
In 1775, in the first edition of his De Generis Humani Varietate Nativa, he described 4 varieties. Then in 1781, 5, and in 1795, introduced some badly needed precise terminology, including the inept but remarkably adhesive term Caucasian.
Now, we've all heard of the word Caucasian before, and so this is who attached that word to certain people.
In each of his enlarging editions, Blmenbach came down hard on his major point. All men belonged to the same species, and his groupings were merely varieties. The differences among men, he insisted, were not nearly so great as those which separated men from apes. Nonetheless, Blmenbach was not without his preferences, for he argued that the original type of man was Caucasian.
He just couldn't help himself, right? You see that? Now, how he came up with this understanding, I really don't know. But what we do know for sure is that he was absolutely wrong. And so, in fact, the light skin pigmentation of the Europeans, it developed about 6,000 to 12,000 years ago, in comparison to the richer skin pigmentation that has been attached to humans since the very beginning. Right? Now, does this mean that the rich skin complexion is any better in general? No. It just means that it was more fitting for that environment that humans evolved in, right? And so the rest of these ideas that some skin color being better or better looking than any other skin color, that's a personal preference, right? And these are ideas that humans come along with later on, and they start attaching to skin colors, right? That's a human thing.
Yet at this critical juncture, he made no attempt to seize the obvious opportunity for constructing a hierarchy of variations. He explained that mankind diverged in both directions into 2, most remote and very different from each other. On the one side, namely into the Ethiopian, and on the other into the Mongolian. He went on to place the American Indian between the Caucasian and Mongolian, the Malay between the same Caucasian and Ethiopian. The white man was the primeval type and stood at the center, but there was no indication that he was on top.
But placing him at the center, that's just as symbolic as placing him at the top. Because what this shows is that humanity centers itself around whites, right? And it's still a form of white supremacy, which Blmenbach just couldn't help but to symbolize.
While Linnaeus and Blumenbach were able to impose order without hierarchy, many natural philosophers were tempted by the synthesizing power of the great chain of being. Clearly, mankind was formed not in one image, but in many. Clearly, men were not equal in energy, talent, manner, and elegance of form. If all other created beings were ranked upon a grand scale, why not man? Could it be that the Creator had graded mankind from its noblest specimens to its most brutal savages?
Or could it simply be the European colonizer who loves ranking people from the noblest to the most savage, right? I've never seen any outside creator being doing any of this type of stuff. But what I have seen is plenty of colonizers doing it for their own personal gain.
The possibilities were there for any European who paused to compare his own society with the newly discovered ones overseas. What happened almost inevitably was that the ranks of men came increasingly to be conceived in terms of physiognomy.
Physiognomy meaning judging people's character based on their facial features.
Sir William Petty, one of the founders of the Royal Society in mid-17th century, was the first to emphasize the gradation among groups of men on the basis of physical distinctions.
Good old Sir William Petty. He was a person who worked hand in hand with colonizers, right? Colonizers such as Oliver Cromwell in attempting to take the land over from the Irish. And so Sir William Petty, he created a method of portioning out the Irish land that was supposed to be taken by the soldiers of Cromwell.
Though there existed those differences between individual man and man, Petty wrote thoughtfully, there be others more considerable, that is, between the Guinea Negroes and the Middle Europeans, and of Negroes between those of Guinea and those who live about the Cape of Good Hope, the Hottentots, which last are the most beast-like of all the souls of men with whom our travelers are well acquainted. I say that the Europeans do not only differ from the aforementioned Africans in color, which is as much as white differs from black, but also in their hair, and in the shape of their noses, lips, and cheekbones, as also in the very outline of their faces and the mold of their skulls. They differ also in their natural manners and in the internal qualities of their minds. For in explaining the vast differences among men, Petty had chosen Europeans and Negroes as representing the extremities of diversity and had based this decision primarily on physiognomic traits. Only after he had finished with the Negro's features was he able to tack on an inherently different temperament and mind.
Another person coming up with arbitrary classifications and winging it.
The work of the Dutch anatomist Peter Camper in the 1770s finally showed where the ideal of hierarchy was leading. It was Camper who pioneered the idea of the facial angle, roughly a measure of prognathism, and who found in his collection of skulls a regular gradation from apes through Negroes to Europeans. It is amusing to contemplate, he wrote, an arrangement of these skulls placed in a regular succession: apes, orangs, Negroes, the skull of an Hottentot, Madagascar, Celebes, Chinese, Mugular, Kalmuk, and divers Europeans.
Now look at where he placed the Negro, right after the orangutan, right? And look at where he placed the European, all the way at the end of the spectrum, right?
It was in this manner that I arranged them upon a shelf in my cabinet. In the long run, this sort of laboratory pastime was more than amusing. In the even longer run, however, this application of the principle of gradation to the facts of anatomy was bound to collapse of its own weight. When examined rigorously, the anatomical differences among men, both fossilized and living, simply cannot be forced into a single continuum.
Because the evidence today, it just doesn't support that idea, right? Even though many people during the colonial period, they may have believed this idea to be true, today it's an outdated idea.
If, for example, amount of hair had been chosen as a criterion of ranking, the Negro would have come out on top, the Indian in the middle, and the white man at the bottom, next to the ape.
And so this goes to show that people could have used many different criterion to create rankings within the human family. Although we don't need these type of rankings, it just shows that there could have been different type of things that were used, right? They could have used the amount of hair like was just mentioned. They could have used people's height. They could have used feet size, right? They could have used the arm length, right? All types of characteristics could have been used to rank people. But the European, they rigged the rankings in their favor, which I guess was wise for them to do at that particular time, right? But only the fool continues to identify themselves as something created to work against them. Only the fool.
It is clear that when Europeans set about to rank the varieties of men, Their decision that the Negro was at the bottom and the white man at the top was not dictated solely by the facts of human biology.
That's because it was also based on creating a world where those who were identified as white would be the ones to dominate, and those who were labeled as black would be the ones to serve. And so it's in many people's best interest to remove themselves completely from that type of classification, right? That was set up by the Europeans and used as a tool of domination, right? And this is something that we did, right? We refused to identify ourselves as black people or people of color or any other type of crazy category that was created by people in colonial times and used for the purpose of domination, right? We call ourselves Earpois, right? Earpois, people of the free world, right? And members join not based on skin color, but based on shared cultural values, right? And so renaming yourself, that's one of the most important steps in climbing out of the pit and entering into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.